professor Alexandru Cismigiu told us in the Faculty of Architecture that reinforced concrete is the most interesting material in the world, but you cannot do neckties and panties out of it. But now I've changed my opinion, because after this research, probably the problem of neckties will be solved very soon. All right, this have been said. I'm proposing you this dilemma, and this is how it could look if we look at it on a blackboard. But I will cover my speech with some pictures. So, maybe you know this fabulous building, which is not ready handover. This is the Philharmonic of Hamburg, which up to now has tripled its price, its costs. One Lord Mayor of Hamburg has resigned because of this building, which is not handovered in 2011 as scheduled. One State Secretary of Culture has already resigned because of this. There were several trials. An exhibition in the Venice Biennale was dedicated to the reflection in the newspapers of the whole process, but nobody says, neither in Hamburg or in Germany, that this building should not be finalized. And what the architects and engineers have proposed is should not be finished and should not become the symbol of Hafen City, of the new development of Hamburg. Why that? Because this is an experimental building. This is top of research. This is the way people are pushing forward. Not repeating the same jokes, not repeating the same patterns, and trying to progress. Why talking about the relation between architects and engineers? Why talking in this way? It's very simple, because it exists. Because I've noticed in my university and wherever I go that this is a very important relation, and that students, I know what's the opinion of students in architecture, I know some of the opinion in students in civil engineering, have this problem and have different attitudes. And I also know from practice, and this is a basic problem to go forward. So, etymology, architekton from Old Greek, and engineer from the Industrial Revolution, from the age of the machine. Of course, you know all of these. This is what Le Corbusier, the well-known architect of the 20s, of the modern era, has sketched about the nature of the architect and of the engineer. One being characterized by having the knowledge of the human, the other one of the physics laws. But as you can see on the half moons, every time the architect is a little bit engineer, and vice versa. So this is very, very, very important. The tools of the architect in two ways. How Marcus Vitruvius Pollio, let's say the godfather of the theory of architecture, wrote in his books, 10 books of architecture 50 years before Christ. And he says that architect should know many disciplines. His science being based on synthetic thinking, rationalism, and practical experience. He should be an experienced draftsman, experienced in geometry, familiar with history, knowing philosophy and music, understanding medicine and laws, having clear picture of astronomy and heaven books. He should know letters, optics, arithmetic, and canonic relations. And on the right part in that drawing, it's a depiction from the Renaissance of an allegoria, if you like, of the tools of the architect, and which somehow sends us to the fact that this is a very complex knowledge. This is a list of architects and engineers in different centuries. of the human evolution. But I put engineers into brackets because they didn't appear only in the modern era, and they were more or less physicists. And I'm sure you can, both of you, engineers and architects, recognize some important names and put them on the same level in the same centuries. I do not insist, but I present you this picture, which you all know, which is the famous San Pietro from Vatican Church. And it is very interestingly related to the moment which is considered the birth of the civil engineering, which is 1748. What happened? The cupola has cracked because of the behavior of the structure. And this report, which Poloni made in 1748, actually is considered the first civil engineer providing solutions for consolidation of this famous building. So everything went differently from that point on. I will now refer to some major engineers, which contributions are without any doubts the most important in the 20th and 21st century. And I refer to a text which Ove Arup, the famous Danish-British architect, engineer, wrote in 1968. Teams for Total Design, says Ove Arup. And let me quote, "The involvement of civil engineers or structural engineers in building is of comparatively recent date. The art of building flourished thousands of years before the idea of structural engineering as a discipline arose. Building developed by trial and error, by experiment and experience handed down the generation and established practice." And I offer you a picture of the Opera of Sydney, another big scandal in the world. In this case, the cost multiplied by 6, and the terms of handover was very, very delayed, but everybody loves it. And Ove Arup continues, "For taking building as a whole, building the right thing is much more important than building things rightly." And I love this quote. And there is where we chiefly go wrong. And I illustrate this with the Coventry Cathedral, which is a combination of old and new by architect Basil Spence with Arup. And the last quote from Arup is about design. Designing is creative accountancy. Everything has to do with money, of course. Everything has to do with interest, but also with creation. This is a recent project of Arup Associates in Qatar. The next fabulous engineer is Peter Rice. Peter Rice joined Arup around 70s, or before 70s. And he wrote in 1992, the year when he passed, a text under the title, "The Role of the Engineer." And he said, "I would distinguish the difference between the engineer and the architect by saying the architect's response is primarily creative, whereas the engineer's is essentially inventive." So we have the two nouns, creative and inventive, which is obviously not the same, but both very important. And this is also something very interesting, also said by Peter Rice in the same text. This is then the noble role that the engineer can assume, the role of controlling and taming industry, taming of the shrew, as Shakespeare says. The building industry has an enormous investment in the status quo, and like Iago, will use every argument to demonstrate that other choices are irrational and not very sensible. So, engineers are the one progress. And the last quotes I'm selecting are from Pier Vittorio Aureli, which was one of the contributors of the last Biennale in Venice, under the title The Common and the Production of Architecture. As you all know, the generic of the Venice Biennale this year was Common Ground, investigating what do we have in common. What do we have in common, architects and engineers, in our case? So architecture is not what is built, not only what is built. It is shared knowledge, out of which every architectural project and every building is made. Shared knowledge. This is the question of authorship. And he continues, and this is also very interesting. Divide et impera is the way in which architecture as collective knowledge is appropriated and mystified by capital as the product of individual authors in the form of parades of iconic buildings. Well, I could talk ages about this, but before finishing and before getting to work in the next room, I will show you what is a group of students from Joseph Lim. This is a faculty in Korea studying about structures. Eccentric structures, what's that? These are structures which are conceived rationally and have an order and a logic which do not always fit into real world conditions of the irrational and unpredictable architecture. So, what if structural ideas were explored as a condition in architecture which challenged the predictable? And they design irrational structures which work. So, partners or competitors? This was the question. I'll give you my answer, both. Partners for good architecture, good building, sustainable future, and competitors at the low level. Both happen. But we have to know that if architects and engineers do not work together, the future is not ours. The capital wins, the commercial wins, and sustainability doesn't appear. Thank you very much.